Hello and welcome to another SonicLAB. That was the sound of the Dave Smith Instruments / Tom Oberheim OB6 desktop. The OB6 is, it's not the new synth because the new synth came out with the keyboard attached. The desktop has just started shipping. And basically it's a 6-voice, 2 VCO analog polysynth. And I say VCOs because, like the Prophet 6, Dave Smith has gone into the method of using VCOs rather than DCOs to actually build the basic architecture. And that's something that, you know, was called for by a lot of people. It makes it a little bit more expensive, but it gives it that certain something. And here is the unit. It's basically a very similar format to the Prophet 6 desktop, but it's got a couple of fairly major differences. The first difference is that we've obviously got the Tom Oberheim SEM filter here. And the SEM filter is a classic filter. It's a 2-pole resonant filter. It doesn't go into full self-oscillation, which you might think might be a bit of a limitation, but you can still get some really beautiful sounds. And what makes it really special is this knob here, which is the transition knob that goes between low pass through notch and into high pass mode. And there's also the bandpass as well, and keyboard tracking half, full and off. The other major difference is in the VCOs. The VCOs have different shapes. On VCO 1 we go from sawtooth through square with pulse width modulation. On VCO 2 we come from triangle through square with pulse width modulation happening a little later in the travel. VCO 2 also allows you to switch off the keyboard tracking and also go into low frequency mode, which is really handy because you can use VCO 2 as part of the cross-mod section, which is more of a kind of Prophet 6 style synthesis. And that's a really powerful section that we've got to the synthesizer as well. Now, the thing about this synth, I remember checking it out at NAMM. When you play it for the first time, you think, oh, that's the synth that does all of those great sounds. You know, we're talking John Carpenter kind of soundtrack stuff. We're talking Jump. We're talking a lot of sounds that you think, I don't know where I've heard those before, and you might assume they're other synths. It's all down to the sound of that SEM filter and certainly the VCOs as well. So let's take a look at the basic architecture of the synth. So if we start here on the VCOs, I've actually got the ability to bring these up on the scope, so you can we'll take a look at the waveforms. Before I do that, let's just go into an init patch mode, and there is a way to do that. You press manual and then right very quickly, and now we just have a simple sawtooth on VCO 1 and sort of basic vanilla kind of patch. So if we start with just a basic sawtooth, you can see we can tune it up to C5 and down to C0, and you can see the shape is actually really nice. If you can see here, you get this little readout on the display that shows you what you're actually at in terms of pitch. So now if I transition this through from sawtooth through to square, you can see how the wave shapes. See it comes through and then into square wave. But all of these are very nicely shaped and consistent waveforms. Now the pulse width allows me to take the pulse width from 0, which is nice because it means you can do those rhythmic things right the way through to almost 100%. And obviously you can modulate these. VCO 2, so if I start with a triangle and I bring it through, you can see it starts to change into a square. But there's this nice little point at which it just kind of gets that high harmonic, and you can find that sweet spot. Then of course it's through into square, and we've got the pulse width. So bringing up VCO 1 and adjusting the DG, we can get those kind of fat sounds as well as tuning fifths or other intervals as well. There's also a sub-octave on VCO 1, which I'll bring that up, which again is a pure square. I think that's different to the Prophet 6 because according to the specs that's actually a triangle wave, so there you go. Additionally, it's possible to pop this into Unison. You can press and hold the Unison and have the number of voices that you want Unison. and then you're able to dial in the amount of detune via this knob over here. So you can get some really nice fat kind of multi-oscillator unison effects as well with this. One other little trick with unison mode is if I play a chord, say this one, and then hit unison, then I've now got that stored as a chord, so I can... And that is stored on a per patch basis as well. One last thing, we've also got a white noise source, which is always handy. So let's just jump out and sort of take a bit more of an overview of the synth now. Additionally, we've got this pair of envelopes, ADSR standard envelopes. One is routed to the filter and the other one is routed to the VCA. The filter can be positively or negatively influenced, and we can switch in velocity for each one. There's also an LFO over here, just a single LFO, and as far as I can tell, just one LFO. There's not an LFO per voice, and that gives you, but it still gives you quite a lot of routing potential. You've got VCO, VCO2, pulse width for both, amplitude, filter frequency, and filter mode, which is handy because that is the magic parameter that really kind of brings this synth to light. Additionally, we've got a pair of effects here, 2 effects engines, plus a distortion. You get to the distortion by pressing and holding the distortion, the effect button, and then dialing in the amount of distortion. It's actually pretty tasty analog. I'll show you some patches of that later. Clocking section allows us to take the master tempo, whether that be external or internal, and divide it amongst a number of beat divisions. We've also got an arpeggiator and a polyphonic chord sequencer, which gives us some nice up to 64 steps of sequencing. Aftertouch routing, VCO 1, 2, LFO amount, amplitude, filter frequency and filter mode, and then miscellaneous parameters is the detune I've shown, also pan spread, which gives us the ability to spread the voices out wide, and then an adjustment for the program volume as well. Down the bottom we've got all the program. This has actually got 999 programs. There's a lot of programs in here, and you bank and you just dial in using these old style buttons, right, and then globals, which are here in a kind of lighter grey legend. Finally, we've got Portamento with a rate and a hold button. Right, so we really want to get onto the filter because that is ultimately what this synth is all about. So I'll start off here. I've just got a little sequence playing, which is just one oscillator. I should also point out there's this other cool little function here, which is pan spread, which does that thing, throws the voices out. Let's bring VCO2 up, which is slightly detuned, a bit of sub-oscillator, got a little bit of filter envelope on this. Now you can hear we're in low pass mode. Start to bring the resonance up. And it's that sound, isn't it? I mean, it's unmistakable. Get some more. That's full resonance. Take the resonance down a bit, and now we'll start to mess with the mode. Coming through notch. What I'm actually going to do is I'm going to bring in the LFO to modulate the filter mode, which I've got clocking to, I think it's a 2-bar cycle against the polyphonic sequencer. I mean, it's just lovely, isn't it? Let's go to bandpass mode. I mean, it's just gorgeous. I mean, there's no real, I mean, it's such a familiar sound. Yeah, sure, it's not self-resonant, and as far as I can tell, you can't actually drive the filter any harder. So the levels on the VC on the mixer don't make any difference to the way the resonance behaves. But it's just that sound, isn't it? It's like a kind of it reminds me a little bit of I don't know if you ever had this, but listening to an old-fashioned battery radio, you know, wooden box radio. Hadn't heard one for years, and then suddenly I heard it, and it's the sound of my childhood, and I just thought that is so comforting and warm, and that's what I'm getting from this, and that it makes all the difference. You know, the SEM filter, you know, yes, it's not the most fully featured, but it just has a sound that is impossible to get any other way. And in a polysynth, it just sounds wonderful. Okay, so let's get on to some of the modulations, because obviously we've got this LFO here. So in this patch, I've just got a fairly simple kind of electric piano style sound, just using VCO1, and I'm modulating the pulse width with the LFO. Now if I bring the frequency in and take it right up, let's dial it, you can see how far it goes into audio rates. We've also got sawtooth, reverse saw and square, and also a nice random. If I take the frequency right round, it turns into white noise, which is a nice little thing. But what you probably notice, if I come back to square wave and play multiple notes, it's just one LFO. There's not an LFO per voice, so it's just essentially a single LFO. The other thing that's kind of interesting about this LFO is that it's unipolar and bipolar depending on which wave. Sine wave is bipolar, which means it goes up and down either side of naught. Sawtooth, square and reverse saw are unipolar, which means that it will take the basic voltage of naught and then go up above. And this is particularly handy if I want to, say, modulate an octave, because it means I can, or another interval, it means that I can dial in the interval and I'm not affecting my bass pitch, because normally with LFOs they're unipolar, so you have to figure out roughly where the center is and get your pitch right, and that's actually quite difficult, so I quite like that. But now if we did want to create this kind of cascading note per LFO per note, we would go into cross mod. So now that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to take this out of here, go back to my sine, so I've got my pulse width modulation. Now I'm going to dial in VCO1, because what I've got is basically VCO2, which is set to low frequency mode, non-keyboard tracking, and a square wave with 50% pulse, is now modulating VCO1, so I'm getting that octave. So that's the patch that I've got at the beginning. But what you'll notice is I've got them all running sort of concurrently. That's because obviously there are 6 VCO2s, whereas there's only one LFO1. But more on the cross mod, because if we take this into other rates, so we'll just now come into, we'll start to take this into audio rates. We start to get some really interesting metallic tones, because we're basically, this LFO, this VCO is running in free running. So if I go into low frequency, out of low frequency, I can dial in these kind of really amazing audio rate kind of modulations, and you get these beautiful sounds. It's like really sort of profit sounding, which is where the cross mod whole thing came from. So you get some lovely sounds. And if I put the keyboard on, keyboard tracking on, gets more musically relevant. So let's try filter mode or filter frequency. We're starting to get some really lovely kind of sonorous, clangorous kind of sounds. And that's the power of the cross mod section. Routing, I can do filter mode, which is obviously a very nice, means I can get those lovely, if I come back into low frequency, but maybe bring it into a triangle. Or I can use the normal bandpass. I have to take that into full. And what that appears to be doing is basically modulating the bandpass button, effectively. So creating some more filter characteristics, and I mean, these sounds are just really nice. It does mean you have to sacrifice one of the VCOs. I mean, it would have been really nice to have either a second LFO or perhaps LFO per voice, because then that would free up crossmod to do even more things. But even with that limitation, you're still able to create some really interesting and unusual harmonic sounds, because you've got this sort of super audio rate or low frequency rate and keyboard tracking modulation source, which just takes you into a lot of different places. Okay, before we move on, we should also point out that there is the ability to modulate these routings via filter envelope as well, so we can create even more patches. So in this one, I've just got a very simple voice. So what I'm going to do is just dial in a little bit, and I'm modulating that by this envelope here. Add a little bit of VCO2, so now I've got perhaps a little bit over the top, but you get the drift, so you can get those kind of second oscillator pitch envelope, or any of the other routings that you might want in there. So we've got a pair of DSP effects here, effects A and effect B, and they can really transform a sound. We've got a whole bunch of different effects algorithms in here. We've got reverbs, we've got delays, we've got some mod stuff and some really nice phases, but there's also a ring mod. So if I just take this patch here, which is a fairly pedestrian sort of pad. Now I'm going to switch in the effects, and we've got ring mod and a bit of chorus. We've got the ability to tune the mod frequency and track the bass note with this parameter here. And generally speaking, the way that you edit, you go A and B, and you've got an A parameter and a B parameter. This is pretty much the only editing you've got. But there are some nice effects in here. We can also clock sync things like the delay settings, so we can get some nice tempo synced effects as well. There's also another effect. If I switch them off, I press and hold the effects button. Then we've got a distortion, which I can start to dial in, which is an analog distortion. And that gives us it's an analog distortion. It gives you that kind of warm extra fuzz, and you can go really all the way up to really over the top, if that's what you actually want. And you can have that without having the other effects on. There's some other nice effects in here. If I just play a patch here that I program. This one's using the phaser, and it's just you can get some quite there's also a model. The ring mod is actually modelled on one of Tom Oberheim's original design, as is one of the phasers. If I just dial in, there's a room and a plate and a spring. Spring's very nice. If we get that up to absolute max and see what that sounds like in terms of ambient, floaty. Try the plate. Room's very nice as well. There's some lovely sounds in there. I would have liked to have heard a really epic reverb. You know, I mean, I'm a fan of the whole sort of freeze and shimmer thing. It'd be nice to see something that could have gone really too much, just so you could dial it back and get those big ambient washes. As we got effects in there, it would have been pretty cool. I mean, a lot of these effects are very basic in terms of editing. You know, you've just got 2 parameters, but there's a nice selection of them, and you can get them to sound very extreme if you want to. And also, because they'll sync up to the internal tempo or external tempo to the unit, you can kind of make them as part of a patch or a sequence or an arpeggio. So speaking of the arpeggiator, I've just got this patch here, which what I'm using is random over 4 octaves, and I'm clocking the LFO sync and the delay to this. Drop a bit of cross mod in there. I can change the clocking of the sequence to 8th triplets, 16th. I've got quite a lot of potential there for all the different clockings. Obviously I can clock this externally, and changing the master tempo would affect all the effects and all the other LFOs in here. It's jolly nice to have an arpeggiator in here, and because we can tempo sync the effects, it really does kind of, create these kind of self-generating patterns, particularly alongside the delay as well. Very nice. Right, so looking at the sequencer, pressing record sends you into step mode. So what I can do here is now I'll just play some parts. And you can see what that's done is just got me through this through to 16 steps. I can have up to 64 steps. Pressing this side will make that step a tie, and this side will make it a rest. So now if I just press play, pressing record, and pressing a note on the keyboard, will transpose the sequence. Guess that might be 80s enough for you. Sequencer is stored per program, as well as the tempo is stored per program. So you could actually create, use this as part of like a backing, I suppose, to songs. There's no parameter recording for the sequence. It's literally up to 64-step sequence, and that's basically a lot. Although you can clock it, obviously, from the internal, with the beat divisions, with external MIDI, all of the usual good stuff. So there we have it. That is the Dave Smith Instruments / Tom Oberheim OB6 desktop analog synth module. Now, this is a premium product, and there's no denying it. It's going to cost you around about $2,300 US, around about 1999 UK pounds. So all of this discrete analog electronics does come at a price. And for many, that's going to be just way unaffordable. And that's just one of those things, really. I mean, you could look at it feature for feature and compare it with other things, sure. But the point is about this, it's a nicely designed instrument. You can interact with it beautifully. It feels like something that you can enjoy and play. And I think that does count for quite a lot. It's got a lot of features. There's a few features that it has missing, LFO per voice, delay on the LFO would have been nice, an extra LFO, if not an LFO per voice, would have been nice. But these are things that, are all going to add to the individual costs. Remember, these are VCOs, analog chips, the whole thing is pretty much designed for a niche market. And if you want that kind of Oberheim sound in a polysynth, I mean, this is pretty much it. It does sound, like I say, really very sort of familiar and comfortable, but it can take you into places that are very extreme or very sweet or very familiar. Those are the things that you can do with it. And you can't do that with a lot of other instruments. You might be able to get close, but this is kind of the real deal. So unless, of course, you're thinking about getting an original Oberheim, which would be lovely, but obviously also very expensive, and also not a desktop, and also it's going to cost you a lot of money just keeping these old guys going, then this is pretty much the only game in town. And it does, like I say, sound really good. Anyway, that's it. Thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.